The hardest apology is the one you never expected to make. By the time the elevator doors closed behind Emily Carter, I had already convinced myself I had made the right decision. Hayes Global Holdings had survived recessions, hostile takeovers, and market crashes because I never allowed emotions to interfere with business. A mistake was a mistake, and consequences were part of leadership. That was the rule I had lived by for more than 25 years. Through the glass walls of my executive office, Manhattan glowed beneath the fading light of late afternoon while employees quietly returned to their desks after witnessing something none of them had expected. Emily had not argued. She had not cried. She had simply thanked me for the opportunity, gathered the small framed photograph from her desk, slipped a notebook into her bag, and walked away with the same quiet grace she had carried every day for the past 6 years. The silence she left behind felt strangely heavier than the conversation that had ended her career. I turned back to the report spread across my desk, determined to move on. 10 minutes later, Daniel from Information Technology appeared at my office door holding a tablet. "Ms. Sinclair, I think you should see this before we disable Emily's company access." I barely looked up. "What is it?" He hesitated before placing the tablet in front of me. Security footage filled the screen. The timestamp matched the previous evening, long after most employees had gone home. Emily stood alone in the records room, carefully organizing files while another employee quietly removed a confidential folder from an unlocked cabinet. Emily noticed it immediately, followed the employee, and returned the folder to the secure archive before locking the cabinet herself. The report that had reached my desk that morning claimed Emily had mishandled confidential documents. The video showed the exact opposite. She had protected the company from someone else's mistake. I watched the recording twice without speaking. The office suddenly felt too quiet. "Who submitted the original complaint?" I finally asked. Daniel gave me the name. It was a department manager who had already admitted to making an incorrect assumption after reviewing additional evidence. The investigation had been completed less than an hour after Emily left the building. I slowly leaned back in my chair, staring through the windows without truly seeing the skyline beyond them. For the first time in years, I had acted before knowing the full truth. I had dismissed the one employee who had never once given me a reason to question her integrity. My phone buzzed with congratulatory messages about another successful acquisition, but none of them mattered. I looked toward the empty desk outside my office where Emily had quietly managed impossible schedules, impossible deadlines, and somehow even impossible days. The desk was already clean, as though she had never been there at all. An unexpected feeling settled in my chest, unfamiliar and impossible to ignore. Regret. Before I had time to reconsider, I picked up my coat, left the office without notifying anyone, and stopped at a small flower shop a few blocks from headquarters. I did not know Emily's favorite flowers. That realization hurt more than it should have. After a long moment, I chose a simple bouquet of white lilies and soft blue hydrangeas because they looked sincere rather than expensive. Less than an hour later, I stood outside a modest brick apartment building on the Upper West Side, the evening air carrying the scent of approaching rain. Warm light glowed behind one of the second-floor windows. I checked the apartment number 1 last time, tightened my grip on the bouquet, and raised my hand to knock. Before my knuckles reached the door, I wondered whether some mistakes could truly be forgiven, or whether I had arrived one apology too late. The hallway remained silent except for the distant hum of traffic drifting through the old apartment building. I stood outside Emily's door with the bouquet still in my hands, suddenly realizing I had negotiated billion-dollar agreements with less uncertainty than I felt in that single moment. Before I could knock, the apartment across the hall opened, and an elderly woman stepped into the corridor carrying a small grocery bag. She smiled politely. "You must be looking for Emily." I lowered my hand. "Yes." The woman glanced at the flowers before looking back at me. "She went for a walk about 20 minutes ago." "She always does when she needs time to think." I nodded, unsure how to respond. "Thank you." As the neighbor disappeared down the stairs, I remained standing in front of the quiet apartment. The warm light beneath the door reminded me that someone had once called this place home after spending every day making my impossible schedule seem effortless. I looked around for the first time. A small welcome mat rested neatly outside the entrance. Beside the door sat two healthy green plants despite the cold weather. Someone had carefully wrapped the pots with thick fabric to protect them from the evening chill. Emily had always noticed small details. Apparently she carried that same kindness into every corner of her life. I left the bouquet leaning gently against her door with a handwritten note tucked between the white lilies. The message contained only 6 words. I was wrong. I am sorry. Victoria. It felt painfully inadequate, yet it was the most honest sentence I had spoken in years. My driver waited at the curb as I walked back onto the quiet street. Home, Miss Sinclair? He asked after opening the rear door. I hesitated before answering. Take me back to the office. The headquarters stood almost empty by the time I returned. Most floors were dark except for a few security lights reflecting across polished marble and glass. I rode the elevator alone to the executive level and instinctively glanced toward Emily's desk. Her chair had already been pushed in neatly. The small family photograph she always kept beside her keyboard was gone. A faint square of dustless wood marked the place where it had rested for years. I stepped into my office but left the door open, something I rarely did. The silence that followed no longer felt efficient. It felt lonely. I opened my calendar for the following morning, expecting another perfectly organized schedule, only to discover empty spaces where Emily usually anticipated meetings before anyone requested them. Reminders were missing. Follow-up notes had vanished. Travel confirmations had not been finalized because there had been no time after her dismissal. None of those tasks had ever seemed remarkable until they stopped happening. Near midnight, I found myself opening an old project folder from 6 years earlier, the week Emily had first joined the company. Every page contained neat handwritten notes in the margins suggesting better solutions, clearer communication, or quieter ways to help struggling coworkers succeed without embarrassing them. She had never tried to make herself look important. She had only tried to make everyone else's work easier. I closed the folder slowly and rested my hands on the desk. Somewhere across the city, Emily was beginning a future that no longer included me. For the first time since becoming chief executive officer, I realized the greatest loss in my career had nothing to do with money, competition, or business. It was the quiet woman whose value I had recognized only after watching her walk away. The next morning arrived with the kind of gray winter sky that usually made Manhattan feel unstoppable, yet everything inside my office seemed strangely unfinished. I arrived before sunrise, hoping work would silence the thoughts that had followed me through the night. Instead, the first thing I noticed was the empty chair outside my office. For 6 years, Emily had been there before anyone else, quietly reviewing schedules while a cup of coffee waited on the corner of my desk at exactly the right temperature. Today there was only silence. Daniel knocked softly before entering with a stack of reports. "Good morning, Miss Sinclair." I nodded. "Anything urgent?" He handed me the files, but his eyes briefly drifted toward the empty assistant's desk before returning to me. "Human Resources would like to begin interviewing candidates this afternoon." The suggestion sounded perfectly reasonable. A company our size could not function without an executive assistant. Yet the words left an unexpected weight in my chest. "Postpone the interviews," I said. Daniel looked surprised. "For how long?" I paused longer than I intended. "Until next week." After he left, I opened the first report only to realize I had already read the same paragraph 3 times without understanding a single number. My attention kept wandering toward details I had ignored for years. The fresh flowers in my office had not been replaced. My morning briefing contained missing pages because no one had noticed the printer stopped halfway through the night. My travel itinerary included a connection that would leave me waiting 2 hours at the airport, something Emily would have corrected without ever mentioning it. One inconvenience after another slowly revealed how much of my life had quietly depended on someone I had mistaken for simply doing her job. Around noon, I walked through the executive floor instead of remaining inside my office. Employees greeted me politely before returning to their work, but conversations seemed different now. Near the break room, I overheard two analysts speaking in lowered voices. "I still cannot believe Emily is gone," one of them said. "She stayed late last month just to help me finish that client presentation." The other smiled sadly. "She also brought soup when my mother was in the hospital. I never even told her what kind I liked." Somehow she remembered. They stopped talking the moment they noticed me approaching. I continued walking without saying a word, but every sentence lingered in my thoughts. None of them praised Emily for organizing billion-dollar meetings or managing impossible schedules. They remembered simple acts of kindness. Back inside my office, I opened one of the cabinets searching for archived contracts. Instead, I found a row of carefully labeled storage boxes arranged with remarkable precision. Each folder contained handwritten notes explaining where related documents could be found, reminders about upcoming deadlines, and suggestions for making future projects easier for whoever handled them next. Emily had prepared everything for a future she knew she would never see. At the very bottom rested a sealed envelope addressed only to whoever sits here next. I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a short handwritten checklist welcoming the next assistant, offering practical advice about the company, the staff, and even me. One sentence stopped me completely. "She works harder than anyone you will ever meet, but sometimes she forgets she is only human. Please remind her to eat lunch when you can." I slowly lowered the paper, unable to look away from those words. Even after losing her job because of my mistake, Emily's final concern had not been herself. It had been me. In that quiet office surrounded by everything I had spent a lifetime building, I finally understood that the greatest measure of a person's character was never found in power or success. It was found in the kindness they continued to give, even after someone had given them every reason to stop. That afternoon, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. Instead of approving another acquisition proposal, I asked Daniel to bring me every performance review Emily had received since the day she joined Hayes Global Holdings. He returned carrying a thick binder that looked almost untouched. I opened the first evaluation expecting exceptional scores, and I found them exactly where they belonged. Reliable. Organized. Thoughtful. Outstanding under pressure. Every manager who had worked with her praised the same qualities. Yet one comment appeared again and again in different words. "Always gives more than anyone asks." I sat quietly for several minutes, turning one page after another. 6 years of remarkable work had been summarized in numbers and short paragraphs, but none of them captured the woman I was only beginning to understand. Around 3 o'clock, the department manager whose incorrect accusation had led to Emily's dismissal requested a meeting. He entered my office looking deeply uncomfortable. "Miss Sinclair, I owe you an explanation." I listened without interrupting as he admitted he had reached conclusions before reviewing all the evidence. He accepted full responsibility and offered to resign immediately. Months earlier, I would have accepted without hesitation. Instead, I looked at him and saw something painfully familiar. A person who had acted too quickly and was now living with regret. "Your resignation will not repair what happened," I said calmly. "What matters is whether you learn from this mistake." He nodded silently, relief and shame crossing his face at the same time. After he left, I realized those words were meant as much for me as they were for him. As evening approached, I walked through the executive floor once again. People worked quietly behind glass offices, answering emails, reviewing contracts, preparing presentations. The company continued moving forward exactly as successful companies always do. Yet I noticed small things I had overlooked for years. A junior analyst struggling with a stack of files. A receptionist skipping lunch because the front desk remained busy. An intern nervously rehearsing a presentation in an empty conference room. Emily had probably noticed every one of them. She would have found quiet ways to help without expecting anyone to remember. Back inside my office, I opened the drawer where I kept personal stationery. My first apology had been only 6 words. It no longer felt enough. I began writing another letter, this time without thinking about titles, authority, or reputation. I thanked Emily for every morning she had quietly made easier, every crisis she had solved before I even knew it existed, every act of kindness I had mistaken for routine. I admitted that I had failed to see the person standing beside me because I had been too focused on the work in front of me. When I finally set down the pen, the page contained something I had almost forgotten how to write. Honest gratitude. I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside a simple envelope. This time, I was not asking Emily to return to the company. I was asking for something much smaller, and somehow much harder. I hoped she might someday allow me the chance to earn back a little of the trust one had so carelessly broken. The letter remained in my briefcase for 2 full days before I found the courage to deliver it. Every morning I told myself I would drive to Emily's apartment after work, and every evening I questioned whether showing up again would only make her life more difficult. On Friday, I stopped making excuses. I asked my driver to take me to the Upper West Side just before sunset. The familiar brick building stood quietly beneath a pale winter sky, its windows glowing with warm light as neighbors returned home from work. My heartbeat felt strangely unsteady as I climbed the stairs carrying nothing except the envelope. The bouquet I had left earlier in the week was gone. I had no idea whether Emily had accepted it, thrown it away, or given the flowers to someone else. I knocked gently and waited. After several seconds, the door opened just a few inches. Emily stood there wearing a soft gray sweater and comfortable jeans, her expression calm but cautious. For a brief moment neither of us spoke. The silence carried more honesty than any speech I had prepared. "I am not here to ask for your job back," I said quietly. "I know," she answered. Her voice remained gentle, but there was a distance I had never heard before. I held out the envelope. "This is only a letter. You do not have to read it today. You do not have to answer it at all." She looked at the envelope before accepting it with both hands. "Thank you." I nodded, realizing I had no right to ask for anything more. "I hope you are doing well." A faint smile appeared for the first time. "I am trying." Those 3 words should have comforted me, yet they reminded me that she was rebuilding a life I had abruptly interrupted. Before I turned to leave, Emily spoke again. "Victoria." I stopped. "You left flowers." "Yes." She glanced toward the small table inside the apartment where the white lilies rested in a glass vase beside the window. They looked surprisingly bright against the evening light. "They are beautiful," she said. "I almost did not keep them." I accepted her honesty without protest. "I would have understood if you had not." She studied me for a long moment. "You have never come here before." "No." "You never asked where I lived." The observation was quiet, not accusing, yet it revealed more about our years together than either of us needed to explain. I lowered my eyes briefly. "There are many things I never asked." Emily did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked down at the letter resting in her hands. "I will read this," she said at last. "That is all I can promise." It was more than I deserved. I thanked her softly and walked back toward the stairwell. As I reached the sidewalk, I looked once over my shoulder. Through the second-floor window, I saw Emily place the envelope carefully beside the vase of lilies before switching on a small lamp. She had not opened the letter yet, but she had not thrown it away either. For the first time since the terrible mistake that had changed both our lives, I allowed myself to believe that forgiveness was not something that arrived all at once. Sometimes it began with something as small as an unopened letter resting beside a bouquet of flowers in the quiet corner of someone's home. The following week passed more quietly than any I could remember. Emily never called, and I respected the silence she had chosen. I buried myself in meetings, investor presentations, and board discussions, but every accomplishment felt strangely incomplete. One Tuesday morning, while reviewing proposals for our annual corporate philanthropy budget, I noticed an application from a neighborhood literacy program on the Upper West Side. Normally those requests would have been delegated to another department. This time, I asked to review it personally. The proposal described free tutoring, career workshops, and reading programs for children and adults rebuilding their lives after difficult circumstances. Something about its quiet sincerity reminded me of Emily. 2 days later, I visited the center without announcing who I was. I left my security detail at the end of the block and walked the remaining distance alone. The building was modest, filled with shelves of donated books, colorful artwork, and the gentle sound of children reading aloud. Volunteers greeted everyone with genuine warmth rather than polished professionalism. As I looked around, I realized this was the kind of place Emily would have loved long before I ever knew her. I almost turned to leave when I saw her standing near a bookshelf, helping a young student choose a novel. She listened with complete attention, smiling with a kindness that seemed effortless. The child laughed before running toward another table, and only then did Emily notice me. Surprise crossed her face, followed by a thoughtful silence. "I did not expect to see you here," she said. "Neither did I admitted with a small smile. "I came to learn more about the program." She studied me for a moment, as though deciding whether to believe my answer. "Would you like a tour?" I nodded gratefully. She guided me through every room without mentioning the company, my letter, or the difficult conversation outside her apartment. Instead, she introduced me to volunteers, explained how donated books reached local families, and described weekend workshops that helped teenagers prepare for college interviews. Every person we met greeted Emily with genuine affection. They trusted her, not because of a title, but because she consistently showed up when people needed her. Watching her move through those rooms, I understood that the compassion I had taken for granted at the office was only one small part of who she truly was. As we finished the tour, we paused beside a window overlooking the small community garden behind the building. Winter flowers had begun pushing through the soil despite the cold. Emily glanced outside before speaking softly. "I read your letter." My heart seemed to stop for a moment. "Thank you for reading it." She nodded. It was honest. I lowered my eyes briefly. "It should have been written years ago." She did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the children laughing in the next room. "I believed for a long time that being quiet meant people would eventually notice the things I did," she said. "Then I realized I also needed to choose places where kindness was valued before it became invisible." Her words carried no bitterness, only wisdom earned through disappointment. I looked around the bright, welcoming center and finally understood what she meant. She had not left simply because she was hurt. She had left because she deserved to be somewhere her kindness was recognized instead of assumed. Standing beside her in that peaceful place, I silently promised myself that if I wanted any place in her future, I would have to become someone worthy of walking beside her rather than someone she merely worked for. The weeks that followed brought changes no quarterly report could have predicted. They did not happen through dramatic announcements or sweeping corporate policies. They happened quietly, one decision at a time. I began leaving my office door open whenever I was not in confidential meetings. I scheduled monthly lunches with department teams instead of expecting updates only through spreadsheets. I learned the names of receptionists, interns, and security officers who had greeted me every morning for years while I hurried past without looking up. At first, employees seemed uncertain whether these changes would last. I understood their hesitation because I was still learning how to become someone different myself. One afternoon, Daniel entered my office carrying a folder of employee feedback collected during an internal survey. He smiled as he placed it on my desk. "You might want to read these." I expected suggestions about workflow or technology upgrades. Instead, page after page described something entirely different. People wrote about feeling heard for the first time. They appreciated that meetings now included opportunities for junior employees to share ideas. Several mentioned that the atmosphere across the executive floor had become noticeably calmer. One anonymous comment caught my attention more than the others. "Leadership feels less intimidating and more human." I read that sentence twice before closing the folder. If someone had told me 6 months earlier that I would consider those words a greater achievement than another record-breaking quarter, I would have dismissed the idea as impossible. That evening, I found myself thinking about Emily again. Not because I wanted to convince her to return, but because so much of this change had begun with the lesson she never intended to teach me. A few days later, I returned to the Community Learning Center carrying several boxes of new books the company had donated. This time, I arrived during a weekend reading event. Families filled the building with quiet conversations and laughter. Emily welcomed me with the same calm kindness she offered everyone else, but there was something different in her smile now. The cautious distance that had once existed between us had softened into gentle familiarity. We spent the afternoon unpacking books, arranging shelves, and helping children choose stories to take home. Nobody treated me like a billionaire chief executive officer. I was simply another volunteer carrying boxes and answering questions. Surprisingly, I preferred it that way. As the event came to an end, we stepped outside into the cool evening air. The small community garden behind the building had begun showing the first signs of spring. Tiny green leaves pushed through the soil beside clusters of white flowers that reminded me of the lilies I had once left outside Emily's apartment. She noticed where my eyes had settled and smiled. "They bloom every year," she said. "Even after difficult winters." I looked at the flowers before turning toward her. "That seems appropriate." She laughed softly, and the sound felt warmer than the afternoon sunlight. We walked slowly along the garden path without any need to fill the silence. For the first time since everything had fallen apart, being together no longer felt defined by guilt or regret. It felt peaceful. Before I left, Emily looked at me thoughtfully. "You really have changed." I considered her words carefully before answering. "I am still changing." She nodded with quiet approval. "That is the difference." As I drove home through the streets of Manhattan, I realized I was no longer hoping for forgiveness simply because I wanted relief from my mistakes. I wanted to become the kind of woman whose actions deserved trust every single day. Whether Emily eventually chose to be part of my future or not, she had already given me something priceless. She had shown me that real leadership begins the moment people matter more than power. Several days later, Emily called and asked whether I would meet her at the small cafe where we had first spoken after everything changed. I arrived early, something I rarely did unless an investor's future depended on it. This meeting felt infinitely more important. The familiar scent of cinnamon and fresh coffee filled the room while soft jazz played quietly above the conversations around us. Emily entered wearing a navy wool coat over a simple cream sweater, her calm smile carrying a confidence I had not fully appreciated during the years we worked together. She sat across from me, and for a few moments neither of us rushed to speak. There was no anger left between us, only two women trying to understand the distance that had once separated them. "I have been thinking about your letter," Emily said softly. "And about everything that happened before it." I nodded. "So have I." She wrapped both hands around her warm mug before looking up. "Do you know what hurt the most?" I answered honestly. "No. But I want to understand." She smiled sadly. "It was never losing the job. I could always find another position. It was realizing that after 6 years beside you, one accusation was enough to erase everything we had built." Her words settled quietly between us. They were not spoken with bitterness. They were spoken with truth. I lowered my eyes for a moment because there was nothing to defend. "You are right," I admitted. "I trusted reports more than I trusted the person who had earned my confidence every single day. I cannot change that decision. I can only spend the rest of my life becoming someone who would never repeat it." Emily studied my face carefully, as though searching for the woman she had known for years beneath the polished confidence I had always worn. "You really believe people can change?" she asked. "I did not before," I answered. "Then you walked away, and I realized success had taught me how to lead a company but not how to value the people who made that success possible." A quiet silence followed. Outside the cafe window, snowflakes drifted slowly across the sidewalk, covering the busy streets with unexpected calm. Emily reached into her bag and placed a neatly folded envelope on the table. "I wrote something too," she said. "Not because you asked me to. Because I needed to." I unfolded the letter carefully. It was not a list of complaints or painful memories. Instead, she described the woman she had once admired. She wrote about the determination that inspired thousands of employees, the courage it took to build an international company, and the quiet moments when she had seen kindness beneath my guarded exterior. The final sentence stopped me completely. I never stopped believing that woman was still there. I only stopped believing she could see me. My vision blurred slightly as I looked back at her. "I see you now, Emily. Not as an assistant. Not as someone who solved problems before I noticed them. I see a woman whose kindness changed every room she entered, including mine." Emily's eyes glistened, but her smile remained steady. "There is something I should tell you too," she whispered. "For a long time, I loved you without expecting anything in return. Eventually I realized I needed to love myself enough to leave." I reached across the table slowly, leaving enough space for her to decide. After a quiet heartbeat, she placed her hand gently over mine. There was no urgency, no grand promise, only a simple choice made freely by two people who had finally learned to speak with complete honesty. In that small cafe, surrounded by ordinary conversations and the soft light of a winter afternoon, I understood that the greatest second chance in life is not being forgiven. It is being trusted again, one quiet moment at a time. 1 year later, the headquarters of Hayes Global Holdings looked exactly the same from the outside, yet everyone who walked through its glass doors could feel that something had changed. The marble floors still reflected the morning sunlight, executives still hurried between meetings, and the trading screens still displayed numbers changing by the second. But the atmosphere was different. Receptionists greeted employees by name. Managers stopped to ask how their teams were doing before discussing deadlines. Fresh white lilies stood quietly in the lobby every Monday morning, their gentle fragrance welcoming everyone who entered. They reminded me of a winter evening when I finally learned that sincere apologies begin with humility rather than words. Reporters occasionally asked what had transformed the company culture. Some assumed it was a new management strategy or an expensive consulting firm. I always smiled and answered with the same simple truth. Success becomes meaningful only when people feel valued. The answer usually surprised them because it sounded too ordinary to explain such remarkable change. Emily never returned as my executive assistant, and I never asked her to. She had built a life that reflected the generosity she had always carried within her, continuing her work at the Community Learning Center while helping expand literacy programs throughout New York. Hayes Global Holdings became one of the center's long-term supporters, but I made certain every contribution remained focused on the mission rather than my reputation. Emily appreciated that choice more than any public announcement I could have made. We still met often, usually at the small neighborhood cafe where conversations had gradually replaced silence. Sometimes we spent weekends walking through Central Park, talking about books, family traditions, favorite places, and all the ordinary moments we had missed while our lives had been defined by deadlines and office walls. I discovered she loved early spring because it reminded her that difficult seasons always ended. She learned that I secretly collected first edition novels, although very few people had ever known. We no longer measured time by quarterly reports or corporate milestones. We measured it by quiet mornings, shared laughter, and conversations that never needed to be rushed. One bright afternoon, the Community Learning Center invited our company to celebrate the opening of a new reading room funded through a partnership that Emily had helped design. Children filled the room with excitement as they explored shelves lined with colorful books. Volunteers greeted families while teachers shared stories about students discovering a love of reading. Emily stood beside the entrance welcoming every guest with the same warmth that had once quietly transformed my office without my ever noticing. When she reached my side, she smiled and gently slipped her hand into mine. This time, there was no hesitation from either of us. Around us, nobody saw a billionaire chief executive officer standing beside a former assistant. They simply saw two women who respected one another completely. As the celebration drew to a close, we stepped outside into the fresh afternoon air. The small garden beside the building was filled with blooming white lilies, brighter than they had been the year before. Emily looked toward them before turning to me with the same peaceful smile that had first captured my attention long before I understood its meaning. "Life has a quiet way of giving people another chance," she said softly. I nodded, grateful beyond words. "Only if they are willing to become better than they were before." We continued walking together beneath the gentle spring sunlight, leaving the building behind without looking back. Looking back had once been filled with regret. Now it was filled with gratitude. I had spent most of my life believing that leadership meant never making mistakes. Emily taught me something far more valuable. Real strength begins the moment we have the courage to admit we were wrong, the patience to change, and the wisdom to treasure the people whose quiet kindness makes every ordinary day extraordinary.